The rope bit into her wrists, a dull, familiar ache that had long since replaced feeling. It was a dry bite, the fibers of the hemp coarse as sand against skin already cracked by sun and neglect. She was tied to a hitching post in the center of what passed for a town. A trading post, a saloon whose doors flapped like tired lungs, and a handful of sod houses that slumped into the dirt. Dust, the color of rust and bone, coated everything. It was in her hair, a fine grit on her tongue, a veil over the flat, endless sky. Her hair was the color of a blood orange left too long in the sun, a shocking spill of color in the monochrome landscape. It was the thing they always saw first, the men who looked at her. It was the thing they commented on, their voices thick with whiskey or want. Now it was matted with grime, hanging in limp strands that clung to her neck. She kept her eyes fixed on a point just beyond the last crooked building, a place where the heat made the air shimmer and the world dissolved into a pale, wavering line. To look at the faces was to let them in. A man named Silas had tied her here. He was a freighter, with a belly that strained the buttons of his vest and a face flushed with cheap liquor and impatience. He had won her in a card game 3 towns back, or so he claimed. She had been a prize, like a dusty bottle of spirits or a worn-out mule. Now he was trying to sell her. Not for much. Enough for a new wagon wheel and a long night in the saloon. The crowd was a shifting, murmuring thing. A few miners, their faces permanently stained with grit, stared with open curiosity. A woman in a gray bonnet pulled her child closer, her lips a thin, hard line of disapproval. Some of the local dine, the Navajo people, watched from a distance, their faces impassive, their blankets drawn tight against the wind that had begun to stir. They saw a woman, a Billigana, a white person, disgraced. Their silence was a judgment of its own, but not on her. It was a judgment on the whole messy, loud affair. Silas's voice was a booming nuisance. Strong back, quiet, won't give no trouble, he shouted to the uncaring air. No one made an offer. The novelty was wearing off. The sun was climbing, leaching the color from the sky, and the townsfolk were turning back to their own meager affairs. The woman at the post was becoming just another part of the landscape, like a piece of broken furniture left out in the wind. She felt herself disappearing, her edges fraying and dissolving into the dust. She did not fight. The fight had been scoured out of her long ago, leaving behind a hollow quiet, a resignation as deep and empty as the land itself. He arrived as the sun reached its zenith, walking out of the heat shimmer she had been staring at. He moved with a stillness that was the opposite of the wind, a quiet purpose in his stride. He was dying, tall and lean, his face a map of sun and sorrow. His hair was tied back with a simple leather cord, and a single eagle feather, worn and gray, was tucked into it. He wore a faded blue shirt and buckskin trousers, all of it covered in the same fine dust as the rest of the world. He carried whole winters in his eyes. He did not look at her, not at first. His gaze swept over the town, the saloon, the men loitering in the slivers of shade. He moved toward the trading post, his worn boots making no sound on the hard-packed earth. He was Hastian, a man whose name simply meant man in his own tongue, a name that felt both vast and achingly plain. He had come for flour and salt, a journey he made twice a year from his solitary hogan nestled deep in the canyons. From inside the trading post, he could still see her through the grimy windowpane, a splash of dying fire against the dun-colored world. He saw the rope, the slump of her shoulders, the way the wind lifted a strand of that shocking hair and laid it across her cheek. He saw the indifference of the crowd, the brutish pride of the freighter. There was no anger in him, only a great and ancient weariness. He had seen this kind of casual cruelty before. It was a weed that grew in any soil. He finished his business, his hands moving with slow economy as he packed his supplies. He traded a finely woven blanket, the pattern a storm cloud trapped in wool, for what he needed. As he turned to leave, his eyes met the trader's. The trader, a man with a face like crumpled paper, just shrugged. It was not his business. None of it. Hastian walked out into the punishing light. He walked past Silas, who was now leaning against a veranda post, sweating and sour. He walked directly to the woman. He stopped a few feet from her, close enough for her to see the intricate cracks in the leather of his boots. For the first time, she lowered her gaze from the horizon and looked at him. His eyes were not cruel or pitying or hungry. They were just still, like deep water. He turned his head and spoke to Silas. His voice was low, not meant for the whole town, but for the man who held the rope. It was a voice that sounded like it came from under floorboards, rough with disuse. "I will take her." Silas straightened up, a flicker of interest in his dull eyes. "Yeah? What's your offer?" Hastian did not answer with words. He reached into a small pouch at his belt and pulled out 3 silver buttons, old Spanish coins that had been hammered into ornate blossoms. They were from his wife's wedding blouse. They were all he had left of her, besides the quiet ache in his chest. He held them out on his open palm. The silver gleamed, a sharp, clean light in the dusty air. Silas stared at the buttons. They were worth more than he had hoped to get. He snatched them from Hastian's palm, his greed a quick, ugly motion. "She's yours," he grunted, already turning toward the saloon. He did not even bother to untie her. Hastian stood there for a long moment, the space on his palm where the buttons had been now strangely cold. He watched Silas disappear through the saloon doors. The transaction was done. An act of commerce. He told himself it was just that. He needed help at his homestead. Pair of hands. That was all. It was a lie, but it was a necessary one. He pulled a small, sharp knife from his belt. The blade was worn thin from years of use. He stepped forward, and she flinched, a tiny, almost imperceptible tightening of her body. He stopped. He held the knife out, showing her the blade, then slowly, deliberately, reached past her and sawed at the thick rope binding her to the post. The fibers gave way with a dusty sigh. The rope fell away from her wrists, leaving angry red welts. She did not move. Her hands remained in front of her, as if still bound by a phantom cord. She kept her head down, her gaze fixed on the dirt between them. She was free, but she did not know what that meant. He did not touch her. He did not speak. He simply turned and began to walk, his pack slung over one shoulder. He walked back the way he had come, toward the shimmering horizon. After a few paces, he stopped and looked back. She hadn't moved. She stood like a statue, a monument to some forgotten sorrow. He waited. The wind whipped the dust around her bare feet. The silence stretched, thin and tight. Slowly, as if her limbs were made of stone, she took a single step, then another. She followed him. She had nowhere else to go. Her past was a burned-out ruin behind her, and her future was this silent man walking into the vast, indifferent emptiness of the land. The journey was a silent pilgrimage. The land they crossed was harsh and beautiful, a place of red rock and stunted juniper trees that clung to life with a fierce tenacity. The sun beat down, and the wind was a constant companion, sometimes a soft whisper, sometimes a mean-spirited howl that threw sand in their faces. Dust lifted behind them like the ghosts of all the steps they had ever taken. Hastian walked at a steady, unhurried pace. He did not look back to see if she was following, but he pitched his gait to the shuffling hesitancy of hers. He knew she was there from the faint whisper of her bare feet on the sandy soil, a sound almost lost beneath the cry of the wind. Hours passed. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple. The shadows of the mesas stretched out like long, dark fingers across the land. He stopped beside a gnarled pinyon tree and shrugged the pack from his shoulders. He pulled out his canteen and drank, then held it out to her. She stared at the canteen for a long moment before taking it. Her hands trembled as she lifted it to her lips. The water was warm and tasted of metal, but it was the first act of kindness she had known in so long that it felt like a sacrament. She drank sparingly and handed it back, her eyes never meeting his. The gesture was a bridge, fragile and unspoken, built across the chasm of their silence. They did not speak. Words felt like an intrusion, a trespass on the vast, sacred quiet of the desert at dusk. They arrived at his home as the first stars were pricking the deep indigo of the sky. It was not a house, but a hogan, the traditional dwelling of his people. It was an 8-sided structure of mud and logs, its single door facing east to greet the rising sun. It looked less like it had been built upon the land and more like it had grown out of it, a natural extension of the red earth itself. A small, fallow cornfield lay to one side, and a simple corral, empty, stood beyond it. The entire place was saturated with a profound sense of solitude. A short distance from the hogan, a small, neat pile of stones marked a grave. There were no words, no cross, just the quiet dignity of rocks stacked one atop the other. It was the heart of the homestead's silence, the source of the winter in Hastian's eyes. He pushed open the door and stepped inside. The air within was cool and smelled of wood smoke and cedar. A fire pit sat in the center of the single room, a thin curl of smoke rising from the gray ashes. A few blankets were neatly folded against one wall, and some cooking pots and utensils hung from wooden pegs. It was a space stripped bare of everything but necessity, clean and ordered, but it felt hollow, as if it were holding its breath. He gestured for her to enter. She hesitated on the threshold, her body framed by the dying light. The doorway felt like a boundary between one life and another, and she was afraid to cross it. He did not press her. He moved to the fire pit, added a few sticks of juniper, and coaxed the embers back to life. Flames licked at the dry wood, and a warm, golden light began to push back the encroaching shadows. The light caught the fear in her eyes. "I do not lock my door," he said. His voice was soft, but it filled the small space. It was not a welcome, but a promise. Promise of safety, not of comfort. She took a slow step inside, her bare feet silent on the cool, packed earth floor. He pointed to a sheepskin and a folded blanket on the far side of the fire. "That is your place," he said. His was on the opposite side. He had drawn a line through the center of the room with nothing but a gesture. He prepared a simple meal of corn mush and dried meat, moving with the quiet efficiency of a man long accustomed to solitude. He ladled some into a clay bowl and set it on the floor near her sleeping pallet. He ate his own with his back partly to her, staring into the fire. The only sounds were the crackle of the flames and the whisper of the wind outside. This was their unspoken contract: food, shelter, and the vast, empty space of a shared silence. She was not a prisoner. She was a presence, another quiet shadow in his house of shadows. The days settled into a rhythm, as slow and steady as a heartbeat. The sun rose, painting the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold, and Hastian would already be outside, tending to the small things that made up his life. He worked in the cornfield, his hands moving through the dry soil. He mended the corral fence, his movements patient and precise. She watched him from the doorway of the hogan. For the first few days, she did little more than exist, a ghost haunting the edges of his routine. She ate the food he left for her and slept on the pallet he had given her. The hollow quiet inside her began to slowly, imperceptibly, fill with the sounds of this new life. The rhythmic chop of his axe, the soft thud of his hoe in the earth, the constant murmur of the wind. One morning, she picked up the small broom made of bound grasses that stood by the door and swept the floor of the hogan. It was a small act, a simple claiming of a task. She moved the dust from the center to the edges, her motions tentative at first, then more sure. When Hastian returned for his midday meal, he noticed. He said nothing, but he left a small cup of sweetened herbal tea next to her bowl. The next day, she found his spare shirt, torn at the sleeve. She took a needle and thread from a small pouch hanging on the wall and began to stitch it. Her fingers were clumsy, but the work was grounding. It was a task with a beginning and an end, a small, tangible way to mend a broken thing. She was stitching their lives together with raw thread, one small, careful puncture at a time. When he saw the mended shirt folded neatly on his sleeping pallet, a muscle in his jaw tightened. She began to explore the small world of the homestead. She learned the path to the spring, where the water ran cool and clear over smooth stones. One afternoon, She stood before the pile of rocks that marked the grave. She knew, without being told, who rested there. She could feel the shape of the loss in the very air of the place. She found a single, stubborn wildflower, a splash of defiant yellow growing in the shade of a rock, and laid it gently on the topmost stone. Hastien saw it later, as dusk was settling. He stopped and stared at the speck of color on the gray stones. It was an offering, an acknowledgement of his grief, given without a single word. He stood there for a long time, until the flower was just a pale smudge in the gathering dark. Something inside him, a place that had been frozen for years, felt a faint, painful thaw. He began leaving things for her. A piece of smooth, sun-warmed sandstone he had found. A bird's feather of an impossible blue. They were small, silent gifts, answers to her unspoken gestures. One evening, a sudden storm broke over the canyon. Rain came down in hard, driving sheets, and the wind howled like a hungry animal. The temperature plummeted. She sat by the fire, wrapped in her thin blanket, shivering. Hastien rose from his side of the hogan, took the heavy wool blanket he had traded for in town, the one woven with the storm cloud pattern, and draped it over her shoulders. The wool was heavy and warm, and it smelled of him, of dust and cedar and wood smoke. The gesture was so unexpected, so intimate, that it made her breath catch in her throat. She pulled it tighter around her, the warmth sinking deep into her bones. The nights were the hardest. The darkness brought back memories that clung to her like wet paper. One night, a dream took her, a suffocating terror of small, locked rooms and rough hands. A cry escaped her lips, thin and sharp. She woke with a gasp, her heart hammering against her ribs. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a weak, pulsing glow. Hastien was awake. He was sitting up on his pallet, simply watching her, his silhouette a dark, solid shape against the faint light. He did not move closer, did not speak. He was just there, a silent guardian in the dark, a bulwark against the terrors of the night. His presence was more comforting than any words could have been. The next morning, the silence between them felt different. It was no longer an empty space, but a shared one, filled with all the things they did not need to say. As he handed her a bowl of warm mush, his fingers brushed against hers. It was an accident, a fleeting touch, but it sent a jolt through her. She did not pull away. He looked at her, really looked at her, and asked the first direct question about her life. "Why were you there?" His voice was quiet, almost a whisper. She looked down at her bowl. The steam rose, blurring the world. She thought of all the towns, all the men, all the reasons that were not reasons at all. She finally lifted her head and met his gaze. Her own voice was a stranger in her ears, thin and rusty. "My husband sold me to pay a debt." Hastien's face was unreadable, carved from stone. But his eyes held a flicker of something ancient and terrible. He knew of such men. He gave a slow, single nod. The story was told. The wound was opened, just a little, to the clean, healing air. He stood and walked to the door, looking out at the rain-washed land. "My wife," he said, his back to her, his voice rough. "The sickness took her. And our son." He did not say more. He did not need to. His grief was now a known thing between them, a second fire in the center of the room. She rose and went to stand a few feet behind him in the doorway. Together, they looked out at the world, no longer two solitary figures, but two people standing on the same patch of earth. Their shared sorrows a quiet bond between them. The house, for the first time, felt less like a shelter and more like a home. It breathed again. A few weeks later, a rider appeared on the horizon. He was just a dark speck at first, slowly growing larger against the vast emptiness of the landscape. Hastien saw him from the cornfield. He straightened up, his hand shading his eyes. A knot of cold dread tightened in his gut. Visitors were rare. Unannounced visitors were almost never a good thing. The woman saw him too from the doorway of the hogan. She froze, the basket of herbs she was gathering slipping from her fingers. Even from a distance, there was something familiar in the man's posture. a slump of arrogance in the way he sat his horse. As he drew closer, the dread took shape, became a name. Silas. He was not alone. Another man, thin as a fence rail and with shifty, nervous eyes, rode with him. They stopped their horses a short distance from the hogan, their presence an ugly stain on the peaceful morning. Silas's eyes swept over the homestead, taking in the mended fence, the tended field, the curl of smoke from the hogan. His gaze landed on the woman standing in the doorway. A slow, unpleasant smile spread across his face. "Well, look at you," he called out, his voice oily with false charm. "Cleaned up right nice." Hastian walked slowly from the field, his hoe still in his hand. He did not hold it like a weapon, but his grip on the wooden handle was firm. He stopped between the riders and the hogan, placing himself directly in front of her. His body was a shield. "You are not welcome here," Hastian said. His voice was flat, without inflection, but it carried the weight of the rock and the sky behind him. Silas spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "I ain't here for a social call. I've come for my property." He jerked his chin toward the woman. "The deal we made, I've been thinking it over. Those buttons ain't enough." Not for the likes of her, he was lying. His pride had been stung by the story that must have circulated, of how a quiet Navajo had bought the woman he couldn't sell. He was here to reassert his power. "The deal is done," Hastian said. "You took the silver. Now leave this land." "She ain't land?" Silas sneered, his voice turning ugly. "She's chattel. I got rights. I came to collect what's mine." He began to swing his leg over to dismount. It happened then. The woman, who had been a silent statue in the doorway, moved. She stepped out from behind Hastian, her face pale but her eyes blazing with a light he had never seen before. She was not the broken creature from the trading post. She was someone else entirely. "I am not yours," she said. Her voice did not tremble. It was clear and sharp as shattered glass. Silas stopped, his leg half over his horse, surprise slackening his jaw. He laughed, a short, barking sound. "Hear that? It's got a voice." He looked at his companion for affirmation. But the other man just looked uneasy, his eyes darting between Hastian's stony face and the woman's fiery gaze. Hastian did not move, did not speak. His stillness was absolute, a silent promise of violence that was more threatening than any shout. He was waiting. This was her fight now, and he would not take it from her. Silas turned his attention back to her, his expression hardening into a mask of cruel possession. "You belong to whoever I say you belong to. Now get your things." "Which ain't nothing." He took a step forward. She took a step to meet him. In her hand, she held a heavy piece of firewood she had snatched from the pile by the door. She held it low, not like a club, but like an extension of her own unbending will. "I belong here," she said, her voice low and fierce. "This is my home." The words hung in the air, simple and profound. It was a declaration, a claiming, not just of the place but of herself. Silas hesitated. He looked from her determined face to Hastian's unmoving form. He saw not two separate people, but a unified front, an unbroken wall of defiance. He had come expecting to intimidate a timid squaw and a silent Indian. He had not expected this. The woman was no longer an object he could reclaim. She was a person, and she was protected. More than that, she was protecting. His bluster crumbled. There was no profit here, only the potential for pain. He was a coward at his core, a bully who only preyed on the weak. He had misjudged them completely. "Forget it," he grumbled, swinging his leg back over his horse. "She ain't worth the trouble." He yanked on the reins, turning his horse so sharply that it whinnied in protest. He glanced back one last time, his eyes full of spite. "You can have her. You're welcome to each other." He and his companion kicked their horses into a gallop, raising a cloud of angry dust that drifted back to settle on the quiet homestead. They watched until the riders were once again just small, dark specks, swallowed by the vastness of the land. The threat was gone. The air, which had been thick with tension, slowly cleared. The woman's arm went limp, and the piece of firewood fell from her hand, thudding softly in the dust. A violent tremor ran through her entire body, the aftermath of a terror she had refused to show. Hastian turned to her. He saw the fear she had held back now washing over her. His hand lifted, hesitated, and then gently, so gently, came to rest on her shoulder. It was the first time he had touched her with deliberate tenderness. The warmth of his hand seeped through her thin shirt, a steady, grounding pressure. "You did not run," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he could not name. She looked up at him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "I was scared," she whispered. "I know," he said, and in those two words, she heard everything. "I was here. I would not have let him harm you. You are safe." They stood there for a long moment, his hand on her shoulder, the silence between them no longer a void but a covenant. The battle had been won, not with fists or weapons, but with two simple words. "I belong." The land itself seemed to exhale around them, settling back into its ancient peace. The house was no longer hollow. It had been defended. It was truly a home. That evening, the fire in the center of the hogan burned brighter. The space between their sleeping pallets seemed to have shrunk. After they ate their meal in a comfortable, familiar silence, Hastian looked at her across the flickering flames. He had been thinking about what she had said. "I belong here. A place needs a name," he began, his voice quiet. "And a person needs a name. The one you came with, it is a name of pain. It belongs to the dust Silas kicked up when he fled." She nodded, understanding. The name she had carried was a brand, marking her as someone's property, someone's discarded thing. It had no place here. He considered her for a long moment, his gaze taking in the strength that had bloomed in her like a desert flower after a rain. He saw the firelight catch the deep red of her hair, no longer a mark of shame but a banner of her resilience. "I will call you Lena," he said. It was not a Navajo name, but it was simple and clean, a name that felt like a new beginning. It held no ghosts. She tested the sound of it in her mind. Lena. It was a smooth stone, a clean slate. It was a gift. She looked at him, and for the first time, a small, genuine smile touched her lips. It transformed her face, chasing away the last of the shadows. "Lena," she repeated softly. It was an acceptance, quiet vow. He had not bought a servant at the trading post. He had not rescued a victim. He had found the other half of his own silence. He had found the person who could help him chase the winter from his eyes. In the weeks that followed, a new life took root in the red earth. They rebuilt the section of fence Silas had almost knocked over, working side by side. He taught her the names of the plants, the language of the clouds. She brought life back into the hogan, her quiet presence a gentle hum against the silence. She hung bunches of dried herbs from the ceiling, their fragrance mingling with the scent of cedar and smoke. The hogan was no longer just his shelter. It was their home. One afternoon, she burned the ragged dress she had arrived in. She dropped the bundle of frayed cloth into the fire pit and watched the flames consume it. The smoke that rose was not the smoke of destruction, but of purification. It carried away the memory of the rope, the auction block, the hollow-eyed men. It was the final death of her old self. Hastian stood beside her, watching the last of the fabric turn to black ash. Fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. The final image of them is one of peace, etched against the vast, painted canvas of the desert. They sat together outside the hogan as the sun went down, not on opposite sides of a fire, but shoulder to shoulder, watching the sky bleed from orange to purple. The silence was no longer a space between them, but the very air they breathed together. The house behind them was alive, its heart beating with a slow, steady rhythm. He was Hastian, she was Lena, and they were home. This story, you see, it is not just about a rescue. Rescue is a single act, a moment of intervention. This is a story about naming. It is about the slow, patient work of giving someone back to themselves. It is about finding a person so broken they have forgotten their own name, and being brave enough to offer them a new one. The world is full of hitching posts. It is full of men like Silas, who believe people can be owned. And it is full of crowds who will stand by and watch. But if you look closely, in the dust and the noise, you might find a quiet man with winter in his eyes. A man who knows the value of a thing not by what it costs, but by what it has endured. And if you are that person, tied to a post by a rope made of sorrow and shame, the bravest thing you can ever do is accept the canteen of water when it is offered. The bravest thing is to take that first step into the unknown desert, following a silence that feels safer than any promise. So here is your naming. Every act of kindness you offer to a broken world is a name. Every moment you stand as a shield for someone who has forgotten how to stand for themselves is a name. And every time you look at your own scarred past and declare, "I belong here, now," you are giving yourself the truest name of all. You are saying you are more than what was done to you. You are saying you are home.